May 1991, Oakland, Alameda County Coliseum Arena, California. Whitney Houston was riding the highest wave of her career, fresh off her legendary Super Bowl performance that had made history just 3 months earlier. The I'm Your Baby Tonight World Tour was in full swing, and this particular night in Oakland, 45,000 fans had packed the arena to witness the voice in her absolute prime. Everything was perfect. The lights were dazzling. The choreography was flawless. Whitney's vocals were otherworldly. But then, during the emotional climax of her iconic ballad, something caught her eye in the sea of faces. Something that made her do the unthinkable. She stopped singing mid-verse, silenced her entire band, and brought 45,000 people to absolute stillness. What happened next didn't just change one concert. It changed how the entire music industry thought about who deserves to experience the magic of live performance. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered whether your voice matters in a world that doesn't always listen, you need to hear this story. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because what Whitney Houston did that night in Oakland proved that true artistry isn't just about perfect notes. It's about seeing the people everyone else overlooks. The weight of perfection was crushing Whitney Houston in the spring of 1991, and nobody knew it. On the surface, everything looked flawless. Her Super Bowl performance of the national anthem had become an instant cultural phenomenon, praised as the greatest rendition ever recorded. The single had climbed to number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100, making her the first artist in history to chart with the national anthem. Her album, I'm Your Baby Tonight, was dominating radio stations worldwide. The tour was selling out in every city. But backstage, in those quiet moments between the screaming crowds and blinding spotlights, Whitney was struggling with something that few people close to her truly understood. The Super Bowl performance had been pre-recorded, a standard industry practice for massive live events. But when critics discovered this fact, they'd attacked her authenticity mercilessly. Never mind that she'd sung the entire track in a single flawless take. Never mind that she'd proven her live vocal abilities thousands of times. The narrative became about deception, about fakery, about whether Whitney Houston was really as good as everyone thought she was. Her longtime musical director, Ricky Minor, watched Whitney internalize every criticism. She became obsessed with proving herself. He later recalled in interviews. Every concert had to be absolutely perfect. Every note had to silence the doubters. She was performing with this invisible jury in her mind, and she could never quite deliver a verdict that satisfied her. The pressure was affecting Whitney in ways that even her closest friends didn't fully recognize. She would arrive at venues hours before soundcheck, sitting alone in empty arenas, staring at the thousands of empty seats that would soon be filled with people expecting perfection. She developed pre-show rituals that bordered on superstition, wearing specific jewelry, eating specific foods, reading specific fan letters before taking the stage. Anything to maintain the illusion of control over something that increasingly felt beyond her control. What made it worse was the isolation of being Whitney Houston in 1991. She was 27 years old, at an age when most people are still figuring out their identities. But she'd been famous since her teenage years. Normal experiences, normal relationships, normal mistakes, all of these were impossible luxuries for someone whose every move was documented, analyzed, and judged by millions. Her relationship with Bobby Brown was becoming increasingly serious, but the tabloids treated their romance as scandal rather than love. Her family relationships carried the complicated weight of shared fame and divergent ambitions. Her friendships existed in the strange ecosystem of celebrity, where genuine connection competed with professional opportunism. The night of May 11th, Oakland was supposed to be just another stop on the tour, another sold-out arena, another chance to prove she was worth the adoration. Whitney arrived at the Oakland Alameda County Coliseum Arena at 4 in the afternoon, 6 hours before showtime. She went through her usual pre-show routine with mechanical precision. Vocal warm-ups, costume check, meet with the band, review the set list, read fan letters. But something felt different that evening. Something felt heavy in a way she couldn't quite articulate. When she asked her assistant Frank DiLio if everything was okay. He assured her that everything was running smoothly. The arena was sold out. The sound system was perfect. Security had everything under control. But Whitney couldn't shake the feeling that this night was going to be different somehow. She just didn't know how different it would actually be. Sarah Mitchell was 23 years old, and she'd been profoundly deaf since birth. She lived in a world of complete silence, communicating through American Sign Language and lip reading, navigating a society that was designed almost entirely for hearing people. Music, in the traditional sense, didn't exist for Sarah. She couldn't hear melodies or harmonies or lyrics, but she could feel them. Sarah had discovered early in her childhood that music wasn't just sound. It was vibration. It was rhythm. It was the physical movement of air molecules that her body could detect, even when her ears could not. She would place her hands on speakers to feel bass lines pulsing through her palms. She would stand close to live performances to feel the drum beats reverberating in her chest. She would watch performers move, using their body language and facial expressions to understand the emotional content of songs that she would never actually hear. Whitney Houston had been Sarah's musical obsession since she was 15 years old. It had started when her older sister Jennifer had been playing Whitney's album on their home stereo system at high volume, and Sarah had felt the vibrations traveling through the floor. She'd placed her hands flat on the wooden boards and felt something she'd never felt before. Power. Not just physical vibration, but something that seemed to carry emotional weight beyond mere frequency. Sarah became fascinated with understanding what made Whitney Houston different from other artists. She would watch music videos with the sound off, studying Whitney's facial expressions, her body language, the way she held microphones, the way she closed her eyes during emotional moments. She read liner notes and magazine interviews translated for her, learning about Whitney's technical vocal abilities even though she could never experience them directly. What drew Sarah to Whitney wasn't just the vibrations or the visual performance. It was something deeper. It was the way Whitney seemed to carry vulnerability alongside her strength. In interviews, Whitney talked about pressure, about expectations, about trying to live up to impossible standards. Sarah understood that feeling intimately. Living as a deaf person in a hearing world meant constantly proving yourself, constantly adapting, constantly fighting for basic accommodations that everyone else took for granted. When Sarah learned that Whitney's I'm Your Baby Tonight world tour would include a stop in Oakland, she knew she had to be there. Her sister, Jennifer, tried to talk her out of it. Why spend money on concert tickets when you can't actually hear the music? Wouldn't it be frustrating to be surrounded by people experiencing something you can't fully access? But Sarah was determined. She'd been feeling Whitney's music through speakers for 8 years. She wanted to feel it live, to experience the physical presence of the artist who had somehow become a connection point between Sarah's silent world and the hearing world she inhabited. Getting tickets wasn't easy. The concert sold out within hours of going on sale. But Sarah's father, Tom, a construction worker who'd learned sign language when Sarah was born, called in every favor he had. Through a friend who worked in building maintenance at the Coliseum, he managed to secure 2 tickets. They weren't great seats. Section 214, high up and far from the stage. But they were inside the building where Whitney Houston would be performing. That was enough. The night of the concert, Sarah wore a white Whitney Houston concert t-shirt she'd bought from a previous tour, even though she hadn't attended. She'd spent hours that afternoon watching music videos, studying Whitney's performances, preparing herself for the experience. Jennifer accompanied her, ready to help interpret the experience, to translate the parts that Sarah couldn't access on her own. When they entered the arena and Sarah felt the first vibrations of the pre-show music through the floor, she started crying. The sheer physical scale of the sound, translated into tactile sensation, was overwhelming in the most beautiful way. This was going to be more than she'd imagined. This was going to be transcendent. Whitney's concert that night was following her usual set list. She'd opened strong with high-energy numbers that got the crowd on their feet. She'd moved through fan favorites with practiced precision. Her voice was in peak form, hitting notes that seemed to defy human capability. The audience was ecstatic, singing along to every word, dancing in the aisles, completely surrendered to the experience. Around the hour mark, Whitney transitioned into the emotional core of her show. She'd moved to a simple stool at the front of the stage, with just a spotlight illuminating her, preparing to perform the ballad section that always served as the concert's emotional centerpiece. This was when Whitney connected most deeply with her audiences, when the spectacle gave way to intimacy, when 45,000 people somehow felt like she was singing directly to each of them. She began singing one of her most emotionally vulnerable songs, her voice dropping to a whisper before building to powerful crescendos. The arena had gone quiet except for her voice and the gentle accompaniment of keyboards. People in the audience were swaying, holding up lighters and early cell phone screens, creating a galaxy of small lights in the darkness. Sarah, high up in section 214, had her hands pressed flat against the metal railing in front of her seat. She could feel the bass frequencies traveling through the structure of the building. She could feel the rhythmic pulse of the drums in her chest. She was watching Whitney on the massive video screens positioned throughout the arena, studying every facial expression, every gesture, trying to understand the emotional content of the performance. And then Sarah did something she'd been practicing for weeks. She began signing the lyrics in American Sign Language. She'd memorized the words to Whitney's songs by reading them online and in CD liner notes. She'd practiced translating them into ASL, creating a visual interpretation of songs she'd never heard. As Whitney sang, Sarah signed along, her hands moving through the air in graceful, precise gestures that translated sound into sight. Jennifer watched her sister, amazed by the grace and intention in her movements. Several people in nearby seats noticed what Sarah was doing. They'd never seen someone sign along to a concert before. Some pointed it out to their companions. Others simply watched, mesmerized by this unexpected form of participation. Down on stage, Whitney was fully immersed in the performance. Her eyes were closed as she held a particularly long, emotionally charged note. The entire arena seemed to be holding its breath. But when she opened her eyes and looked out at the sea of faces, something caught her attention in the upper sections. A young woman in a white concert t-shirt was moving her hands in patterns that Whitney recognized immediately. She was signing the lyrics to Whitney's song. Whitney had grown up around sign language. Her mother, Whitney Houston, had performed at benefit concerts for deaf schools throughout Whitney's childhood. Whitney had learned basic ASL as a teenager, enough to communicate simple greetings and phrases. She recognized what she was seeing, even from a distance. Whitney stopped singing mid-verse. The sudden silence was shocking. 45,000 people, whose seconds before had been lost in the music, were suddenly jolted into confusion. Had something gone wrong? Was Whitney okay? The band, unsure what was happening, gradually stopped playing. The gentle keyboard notes faded away. The drums went silent. Within seconds, the entire massive arena was completely, absolutely quiet. Whitney stood up from her stool and walked to the front of the stage. She held up her hand, signaling to her band not to restart. She looked up at section 214, squinting slightly against the stage lights to see more clearly. Tour manager, standing in the wings, was frantically gesturing, trying to figure out what was wrong. The lighting director kept the spotlight on Whitney, not knowing what else to do. Security guards at the edge of the stage exchanged confused glances. 45,000 people were silent, watching, waiting to understand what was happening. Whitney spoke in her microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the arena's sound system, even though she was no longer singing. There's a young woman up in section 214. She's signing the words to my song, signing them beautifully. The audience murmured, thousands of heads turning to look up at the section Whitney had indicated. Sarah, suddenly realizing that Whitney Houston was talking about her, felt her heart start racing. Jennifer grabbed her sister's hand, equally shocked. Whitney continued speaking. Most of you don't realize this, but there are people in this arena tonight who can't hear my voice. They can't hear the band. They can't hear the music the way you're hearing it. But they're here anyway. They're experiencing this concert in ways that I'm only beginning to understand. Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face. Other people in Section 214 were looking at her with new awareness, understanding suddenly that she was deaf, that she'd been experiencing the concert in a fundamentally different way than they had. Whitney made a decision that her tour manager would later call either the bravest or the craziest thing he'd ever seen. She turned to her band and her backup singers. "Come to the front of the stage. All of you. Bring your instruments if you can move them. Otherwise, just come up here." The band members exchanged glances, then began moving forward. Keyboard players disconnected portable keyboards. The drummer left his kit behind. Guitar players carried their instruments. The backup singers, 3 women who'd been positioned at the rear of the stage, walked to the front. Within a minute, Whitney's entire musical ensemble was gathered at the front edge of the stage, looking out at the audience, not quite understanding what Whitney was planning. Whitney spoke to the crowd again. "We're going to do something I've never done at a concert before. I want everyone in this arena to experience this song the way that young woman up there is experiencing it. Through sight, through feeling, through connection that goes beyond sound." What Whitney did next was unprecedented in arena concert history. She asked her sound engineer to cut all the sound going to the main speakers. No music, no microphone amplification, nothing, just the natural acoustics of the arena. Then she turned to her band and backup singers and began teaching them sign language. Not fluent ASL, just basic signs. Simple gestures that could convey emotion and meaning. She had them practice with her 45,000 people watching this impromptu sign language lesson happening in real time on one of the biggest stages in America. The audience was mesmerized. People were crying. Parents who had deaf children were filming on their early video cameras. Deaf attendees scattered throughout the arena, who up until this moment had felt like they were observing the concert from outside, suddenly felt seen in a way they'd never experienced at a live event. When Whitney and her ensemble had practiced enough basic signs, she began the song again. But this time it was different. This time, Whitney sang without amplification. Her natural, acoustic voice, as powerful as it was, could only reach the first few rows. The people in the back sections couldn't hear her at all. For the first time in their lives, hearing audience members were experiencing what deaf attendees experienced at every concert. The exclusion, the frustration, the feeling of being on the outside of something magical happening just out of reach. But they could see everything. They could watch Whitney signing the lyrics as she sang them. They could see her backup singers moving in synchronized gestures. They could observe the band members swaying to rhythms that most of the arena could no longer hear. And most importantly, they could watch the massive video screens positioned throughout the arena, which were now showing close-ups of Whitney's face and hands as she performed this unique version of her song. Sarah, in Section 214, was experiencing the most profound moment of her life. She was watching Whitney Houston, her idol, performing in a way that centered Sarah's experience instead of excluding it. Whitney wasn't just acknowledging that deaf people existed. She was restructuring her entire performance to honor the way they experienced music. Jennifer was sobbing, watching her sister's face transform with joy and recognition and validation. All around them, people in their section were crying too, moved by the radical act of inclusion they were witnessing. After the first verse, Whitney did something even more unexpected. She spoke directly to Sarah, still without amplification, trusting the cameras to capture her words. "Come down here. Please. I want you on this stage with me." The audience erupted, not in the screaming chaos of typical concert applause, but in a wave of supportive cheering that seemed to physically move through the arena. Security guards received urgent instructions through their earpieces. A path was cleared. Sarah, shaking and crying and barely able to process what was happening, was escorted from her seat down to the floor level. Jennifer came with her, holding her sister's hand, providing support and translation. When Sarah reached the stage, Whitney knelt down and took both of her hands. She spoke slowly, clearly, making sure Sarah could read her lips. "Thank you for reminding me why I do this. Thank you for showing me that music is bigger than sound. Whitney then did something that would become one of the most iconic moments in concert history. She invited Sarah to stand beside her at the center of the stage. She asked the lighting director to bring up all the house lights so that every single person in the arena could see each other clearly. No more darkness. No more anonymous crowd. Just 45,000 individuals, all visible, all present, all connected. And then Whitney Houston and Sarah Mitchell performed together. Whitney sang, her voice now amplified again so everyone could hear. Sarah signed, her hands moving through the beautiful, graceful gestures of ASL, translating Whitney's sung English into visual poetry. The backup singers, following Sarah's lead as best they could, added their own attempts at signing. The band played with heightened emotional intensity, understanding that they were part of something historic. When they reached the climactic note at the song's emotional peak, Whitney held the note with her legendary vocal power while Sarah's hands moved through an ASL gesture that translated to "My heart is full." The arena erupted. 45,000 people were on their feet, applauding with such force that it became its own kind of music. The concert continued after that moment, but nothing was the same. Whitney performed the rest of her setlist with Sarah remaining on stage, signing songs she'd never dreamed she'd be interpreting. Jennifer had been brought to the wings, watching her sister live out an impossible dream. Other deaf attendees in the arena reported later that they could feel the vibrations of the applause, the physical sensation of 45,000 people expressing collective joy. News of what happened at the Oakland concert spread immediately. This was 1991, before social media, before viral videos, but word still traveled fast. Concert bootleg traders, who typically focused on audio recordings, began circulating video footage of Whitney's performance with Sarah. MTV covered the story. Entertainment Tonight ran a segment. Newspapers across the country published features. What made the coverage different from typical feel-good human interest stories was the conversation it sparked. Disability rights advocates seized on Whitney's action as an example of what genuine inclusion looked like. It wasn't about providing a separate, lesser experience for deaf attendees. It wasn't about offering closed captioning on a screen in the corner. It was about restructuring the entire experience to center the needs of people who were typically marginalized. Within months, concert venues across America began offering ASL interpretation at major shows. Artists started including deaf accessibility as a standard part of their production planning. The Americans with Disabilities Act had been signed into law just the year before, and Whitney's Oakland concert became a cultural example of what the law's principles looked like in practice. But the impact went beyond policy and industry practice. For deaf individuals who had always loved music but felt excluded from live concert culture, Whitney's action was validating in a profound way. She'd proven that their experience of music was legitimate, that their way of connecting with art was valuable, that they belonged in spaces that had always seemed designed to exclude them. Sarah Mitchell's life changed fundamentally after that night. She became an advocate for deaf accessibility in the performing arts. She worked with venues to develop better accommodation programs. She trained ASL interpreters who specialized in music interpretation, teaching them techniques for translating rhythm, emotion, and sonic texture into visual language. Whitney and Sarah maintained contact after the Oakland concert. Whitney would call Sarah before major performances, asking for advice on how to make her shows more accessible. When Whitney performed at the 1994 World Cup, she ensured ASL interpretation was visible for television audiences. When she performed at charity events, she specifically requested that deaf organizations be included in ticket distributions. The relationship between Whitney and Sarah became a friendship built on mutual respect. Whitney never treated Sarah as an inspiration or a charity case. She treated her as an equal, as someone who had taught Whitney something essential about what it meant to perform. Whitney's Oakland moment was celebrated by fans and disability advocates, but also came with professional consequences. Her tour management was furious about the disruption to the carefully planned show. Corporate sponsors worried that Whitney was becoming too political, too unpredictable. Some music industry executives suggested that Whitney was being manipulated by disability activists, that she was naively letting herself be used for causes she didn't fully understand. Radio programmers questioned whether Whitney's focus on accessibility issues was distracting from her music. Conservative critics accused her of wokeness before that term even existed, suggesting that she was pandering to special interest groups instead of focusing on entertainment. The criticism hurt Whitney, but it also clarified something for her. The Super Bowl controversy had been about whether she was authentic enough, talented enough, real enough. The Oakland concert showed her what authenticity actually meant. It meant seeing people. It meant responding to human connection over professional calculation. It meant understanding that art wasn't just about perfect execution. It was about creating moments of recognition between people who felt unseen. In interviews after Oakland, Whitney spoke about that night with the kind of conviction she rarely showed when discussing her own accomplishments. "That girl in Section 214 gave me permission to be imperfect," she told Oprah Winfrey in a 1993 interview. "She reminded me that the most important thing I can do isn't hitting the highest note. It's helping people feel less alone." Whitney incorporated elements of the Oakland experience into all her subsequent tours. She hired full-time ASL interpreters who stood visible near the stage at every concert. She created tactile listening stations at venues, where deaf attendees could feel bass vibrations through specialized platforms. She donated portions of her tour proceeds to organizations serving deaf and hard-of-hearing communities. But beyond the formal accommodations, Whitney changed how she thought about her audience. She stopped seeing them as an undifferentiated mass of fans and started seeing them as individuals with diverse needs, diverse experiences, diverse ways of connecting with her art. The pressure of being Whitney Houston never fully disappeared. The tabloid scrutiny intensified. Her relationship with Bobby Brown became increasingly turbulent. Her struggles with substance abuse, which had been developing quietly for years, began to take visible tolls on her health and voice. But people who knew Whitney during the 1990s said that the Oakland concert remained a touchstone for her. When she doubted herself, when the criticism felt overwhelming, she would return to the memory of Sarah Mitchell signing her lyrics in Section 214. She would remember that moment of connection, that instance of being seen and seeing someone else, and it would remind her why any of the rest mattered. When Whitney Houston died in 2012, Sarah Mitchell spoke at a memorial service in Oakland. She told the story of that night in 1991, describing what it had meant to her, what it had meant to the entire deaf community. She signed her remarks in ASL while speaking them aloud, honoring the dual-language approach that Whitney had pioneered that evening. "I was 23 years old, and I'd never felt like I belonged at a concert," Sarah said through tears. Whitney Houston stopped her show, disrupted her entire performance, risked professional consequences, all to show me and everyone like me that we mattered. She taught 45,000 hearing people what it feels like to be excluded, and then she taught all of us what inclusion actually requires. Today, ASL interpretation at concerts is standard practice for major artists. Deaf accessibility is considered a basic element of event planning. Music festivals provide tactile listening stations and visual interpretation as a matter of course. None of this was inevitable. It happened because one artist, at the peak of her fame, chose to see someone everyone else had overlooked. The video footage of Whitney and Sarah performing together has been viewed millions of times online. It's used in disability studies courses. It's shown in ASL classes. It's referenced in discussions about what genuine accessibility looks like. But beyond its educational value, it remains simply beautiful. Two women connecting across difference, creating something together that neither could have created alone. Sarah Mitchell still attends concerts regularly. She's now 56 years old, a respected advocate and educator. At every show she attends, no matter the artist, there's an ASL interpreter visible near the stage. And every time she sees that interpreter, she thinks of Whitney. She remembers being 23 years old in Section 214, signing lyrics to songs she couldn't hear, hoping someone would notice. And someone did notice. The most famous vocalist in the world stopped everything to make sure Sarah knew she belonged. That's the real story of Oakland. Not just what Whitney did that night, but what it represented. The choice to prioritize human connection over professional perfection. The willingness to disrupt systems that excluded people. The courage to use privilege and platform not just to perform for people, but to perform with them. The question Whitney's Oakland concert poses to all of us is simple but challenging. Who are we overlooking? Whose experience are we not considering? What would it cost us to stop, to really see someone, to restructure how we do things so that more people can participate? For Whitney Houston, on that May night in Oakland, the cost was a disrupted concert, professional criticism, and corporate displeasure. But what she gained was infinitely more valuable. She gained connection. She gained purpose. She gained the knowledge that her art had created a moment of belonging for someone who had always felt like an outsider. And 45,000 people learned something that night, too. They learned what it feels like to be excluded when sound disappeared. They learned what it looks like to be included when Whitney brought Sarah on stage. They learned that music is bigger than hearing, that art is bigger than the senses we typically use to experience it. This is the story you need to share. The story of the night Whitney Houston proved that seeing people matters more than anything else. Share this with someone who has felt invisible. Share it with someone who needs to know they belong. Hit that like button if this story moved you. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we have more stories that prove compassion changes everything. Until next time, remember the most powerful thing any of us can do is stop, really look, and see the people everyone else is missing.